Hello, beautiful people, and welcome. Hi. To what's gonna be a bit of a long video, probably, maybe, perhaps. We're going to be looking at all of it, basically. I've made a video on Hyperbloom, and I've made a video on Salad. Effectively, Hyperbloom, just the baseline reaction, and Salad, which is using an Anemo unit to trigger your Hyperbloom. None of that really needs gauge theory to understand what makes it good. However, most of the other Bloom teams really need to look a bit deeper into gauge theory to understand why they're good and what makes them good or why they're bad and the kind of obstacles they have to get past. So in this video, I'm going to be covering Burgeon and a little bit of Bloom, so non-Nilo Bloom teams, as well as all of the ways that you can combine different ideas from Hyperbloom, from Salad, from Burgeon, from Bloom together in order to kind of alter your team in a way that kind of makes a different archetype because it just ends up working a little bit differently, but that is still using the same reactions. Let's start with just the baseline Burgeon stuff. When you apply Dendro and Hydro, you trigger Bloom, and then it generates a seed on the gun, and if you attack that seed with Pyro, you make it explode, dealing Dendro damage and triggering Burgeon. Because it's a two-step reactions and it involves three elements, that also means that you're forced to have a Hydro and a Pyro unit in your team, which can trigger Vaporize, and a Dendro and a Pyro unit in your team, which can trigger burning. I'm gonna have to disable my alerts. Now, the thing with burning reactions is that if the enemy is burning and you hit them with Hydro, you're gonna vaporize, but you're not gonna bloom. You're still gonna have your Dendro going, right? But you're not gonna bloom. So you're gonna need to attack them with Hydro twice. What that means is that if you end up with very fast Dendro application, you'll trigger a lot of burning, which means that you're also going to be needing very fast Hydro application if you want to actually trigger bloom, because just decently fast Hydro application isn't gonna be enough. Decently fast Hydro application is just gonna remove the burning, but it's not actually gonna trigger seeds. You'll start being able to get your stuff going, and that's cool, but soon you're gonna realize we're not actually generating any blooms, right? And because we're not generating any blooms, we're also, there we got our first Burgeon. We're also basically not getting any Burgeons. You might get a few every once in a while when you get your app to luckily line up well, but you will very often just not get a lot of Burgeons because you're just not generating seeds. You're not applying enough Hydro. Because of that, you're going to have to alter your teams to deal with that. A good example of a thing you can do is you can go for slower Pyro application. You go for something like Toma, for example. Toma will hit with Pyro often, so he'll be able to trigger the Burgeons, but he has internal cooldown, which means that he won't always apply Pyro to the enemy. Let's get our stuff going. Very cool. Now, by doing that, the enemy is burning less often, and because the enemy is burning less often, we get more Burgeons. Pretty straightforward. More burning you have, the harder it is to get a lot of blooms. And by the way, the reason why it works like that is because the burning aura is always going to be 2 units of burning, no matter how long you let it last on the enemy. As long as the burning aura is there, as long as the enemy is currently burning, it will be 2 units. And so, with the way that Vaporize works, anytime you apply 1 unit of Hydro, you're gonna remove all of those 2 units. But because of the way that reactions work, you're removing 2 units and you have 2 units, which means that all of your Hydro is going towards removing that. Which means that none of your Hydro is left after that Vaporize to get through to the Dendro that's left on the enemy. If you were to apply 2 units of Hydro instead, so for example, if I were to use Child's E, I get a Vaporize and a Bloom. Whereas if I use Barbara's normal attack, which is 1 unit of Hydro, we only get the Vaporize, we don't actually get a Bloom. The thing is, you can weaken that burning by triggering a reaction. So for example, if I trigger burning like this, and then I do this, I do still get a Bloom that I can Burgeon. The reason for that is because by swirling the enemy, we didn't just swirl Pyro, we also swirled Burning. It's not going to spread Burning, but it is going to weaken the Burning aura from the enemy. And it's going to weaken it from 2 units of Burning to 1.5. And once you've done that, then 1 normal attack from Barbara, that applies 1 unit of Hydro, because it removes 2 units of Pyro, you still have a little bit of Hydro left over to react with the Dendro, and therefore, you get a Bloom. Let's do it again, just to show that it's not like a luck thing. Another one. What that means is that any time you add an element that isn't Hydro, Pyro, or Dendro to your Burning team, an element that won't fuck your reactions too much, but that will weaken the Burning aura, it's gonna help you generate more seeds. Or maybe not more, depending on the team, but it's gonna help you generate seeds more easily. Because of that, you end up with a lot of different archetypes that use a different mechanic from an element, or in order to supplement your Burgeon team with more seeds, even if it's not directly a unit that applies Dendro or Hydro to generate more seeds. For now, let's look at just the Dendro and Hydro. So if you stick to only Dendro and Hydro, you'll basically have 2 options. The one that I explored a little bit already, which is get some Pyro and all, and that's cool, and lose some seeds because you're maintaining a Dendro aura. Or you can try to maintain a Hydro aura by just applying so much Hydro. Generally, trying to maintain Dendro aura will not be a good idea in only Burgeon teams where you stick to those 3 elements and you add a last unit of the same element, because it's going to be difficult to apply enough Dendro to keep Dendro as the aura, but also apply enough Hydro to actually generate seeds. The only exception to that isn't really an exception. It's like a fake exception where you are kind of doing that, but you're also just applying a lot of Hydro, so it's not always a Dendro aura, it's just sometimes a Dendro aura. And in this team, you kind of just rely on just applying so much of both Hydro and Dendro that you're basically going to get seeds even if you proc Burning. The biggest issue with a team like that is just that you don't have a healer in a Burgeon team, which means that you're going to die eventually, right? Especially in my case where my Toma doesn't actually have levels on his talents for his shield. And so it can be a good team, but you have to be careful. You can also replace one of the 2 Hydro options with Kokomi and it can function, but it's generally just not what I would gravitate towards when it comes to Burgeon teams unless you really know what you're doing. It's not the first Burgeon team I tried, basically. The other idea, so right, just applying a lot of Hydro and just not ending up with too much Burning. You can actually use the exact same team for it, but obviously you don't need to. But you just apply less Dendro. So you don't on-field your Nahida, you on-field your Yelan instead, for example. So I don't have Kokomi, but Kokomi would be a very good, like, example of a thing you could do with it. I use Ayato instead. I guess I should probably show it in Abyss, because it's a lot more of an AoE team. This is probably not a good rotation, but... yeah, that was a very bad rotation. Don't do this at home, kids. These are another type of Burgeon teams that you can do. They're very functional. The biggest issue that you could have with this is basically just that you're playing a team that's focused on its capacity to be very good in AoE and to do a lot of AoE damage, and you're not giving it a grouper, which means that it'll be very good in this Abyss because this Abyss was designed to make it easy for Hoyo to convince you that Nilo's broken, and so all the enemies end up relatively close together and you're in against a lot of enemies. They're easy to group, all that, but it won't always be the case, so just keep that in mind, that it can be difficult to make these kinds of Burgeon teams work in some situations. So what's the solution when you're not against that? Generally, there's 2 solutions that I really like. The first one is when you're in single target, just baseline Burgeon stuff isn't as good, and so you can basically take away some of your Burgeon damage and exchange it for a different form of damage. For example, overloads. I've already made a video on the Curry teams, right? The Burgeon teams with Electro, but they're very much a possibility. One of the advantages of a team like this is, unlike the previous thing thing that we looked at with double Hydro instead of Fischl Xingqiu. You're generating a bit less Burgeons, but most importantly, there's a smaller portion of your damage that's coming from Burgeons, and that lets you get away a lot more easily without necessarily needing a healer. Now, obviously, you still can play a healer in this, and you definitely could replace your Xingqiu with a healer, but that is one of the upsides, because you have a new portion of your damage that's coming from different types of reactions. I did not dodge. It also lets you swap a lot more because you can kind of just do whatever. That being said, it's not always going to be better than just using Xingqiu Yilan, because obviously Xingqiu Yilan is just a really strong baseline, but it is definitely something you can do, and because you have more flexibility in your swaps, you don't have to take all your damage on one character, which means it's easier not to die. Obviously, this is somewhat of just personal experience stuff, but in the Curry teams, I've managed to stay alive a lot more consistently than the pure Burgeon teams. But yeah, some of your Burgeons are going to become Hyper Blooms because Fischl will sometimes hit them. When you're in AoE, you can use Beidou. But this is one of the teams that you can do, or one of the archetypes that you can do with Burgeon. The way you're generally going to want to go about building that is, as usual, you don't want a Pyro unit that has too much Pyro application. However, because we have an Electro, and when you apply Electro to a burning enemy, same thing as when you apply Anemo to a burning enemy, in the sense that you weaken the burning aura, and you can use the weakening of the burning aura to get your seed to be generated even if the enemy is burning, whereas otherwise you wouldn't be able to without 2 units of Hydro. On top of that, whenever you trigger Quicken, you might get a few aggravates or spreads here and there. The main thing is that Electro can help prevent your burning from fucking you over that much. And so if you want to use a unit that applies more Pyro, you can, because the Electro is helping you still generate like a decent amount of seeds. You'll still be able to generate a decent amount of seeds even if you end up going double Hydro, but the Electro is helping you nonetheless. When it comes to these teams, the speed of your Pyro application, it's still generally better to have a bit lower, but it's not the end of the world if you have more. And you can actually take advantage of more because you can trigger more overloads. Your Electro app, you want it to be as fast as possible because more is better, but you don't want it to hit the seeds. So generally it's going to be either Fischl or Beidou. Fischl will sometimes hit the seeds, but not too much, and Beidou won't hit them at all from her burst like bounces. Dendro app as much as possible, Hydro app as much as possible. But the more Dendro app you have, the more you can trigger burning, which means the slower Pyro app you'd want. Whereas Hydro app, you can just never have too much. Which is one of the reasons why I like Xingqiu, because Xingqiu's Hydro app is just second to none from off field. You can use a unit like Child as well, but his rotational limitations actually do matter in Burgeon teams a lot. So I don't like it as much. Anyways, like I said, that's not the only way that you can fix that. You can also use Anemo, and your Anemo is going to swirl the Pyro and the Burning Aura, and it's going to reduce the strength of your Burning Aura, and it's going to let you trigger blooms more reliably. But then on top of that, your Anemo unit can group enemies if you're using an Anemo unit that groups. And if it swirls Pyro, it can trigger Burgeon. And if it swirls, if it has a way to absorb Pyro, it can also trigger Burgeon from that. Kind of fucked up the setup a little bit there, but it is what it is. In a team like that, obviously you're focusing a lot more on AoE damage, which means that Xingqiu's single target application isn't the only option you have, so you can use a unit like off-field Ayato or Kokomi instead. I forgot to do that. I forgot burning does the thing. I let burning do its annoying thing. Fuck. For those of you who didn't know, burning damages you if you're close enough to the enemy that's burning. And unlike Burgeon and Hyper Bloom, it doesn't do reduced damage to you. It does the same amount that it does to the enemies. So be careful when you trigger burning. Anyways, Anemo and Electro are generally the main ones, but they're not the only ones. There is another. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you might have known that before the release of Dendro, I was pretty excited about a mechanic called Fridge, but that I haven't really talked much about it since the release of Dendro. The main reason for it being that the units we have don't synergize with Bloom teams that well outside of Nilo teams. And so most Fridge teams generally felt pretty underwhelming. Now that's still somewhat the case, but Fridge teams are still pretty good in content that's designed for Bloom, such as the current Abyss. And so I can still show you guys a basic example of a Fridge team. Well, so it still obviously functions pretty well in content that's designed for it. But outside of it, it's very, very weak. There are ways to make it a bit easier for that content to be a thing. So like I said, this Abyss is designed for Bloom because the enemies group together naturally. But if that weren't the case, you could still make Fridge teams function through using an Anemo unit in them, because Anemo units can swirl Hydro, and when they swirl Hydro, or when they infuse Hydro, they can get Blooms. Very cool. But still, as a general rule, Fridge teams are somewhat niche, and it's very, very difficult to make them not shit in single target. The Fridge mechanic is basically something that you can use to generate more seeds. As you can see from my Xingqiu E, I generated 3 seeds after using a normal attack on Nahida and an E on Diona. If you don't use your Diona E, you will only get 2 seeds. Effectively, by adding Cryo onto the enemy, you end up triggering Freeze before you trigger Bloom, and that means that you're consuming less of your Dendro aura so you can trigger more seeds. But then on top of that, it also makes it so usually, if you're just applying a lot of Hydro and a bit of Dendro, most of the time the enemy will have a Hydro aura. Which means that most of the time, the character that will be triggering your blooms, the character that will be triggering your reaction, is going to be your Dendro character. When you Fridge, when you add a bunch of Cryo application, as you can see, it becomes a lot easier to keep Dendro as an aura on the enemy. and we end up getting our Hydro unit to trigger a larger portion of our seeds. And if we want our Hydro unit to be the trigger, that's good. But here's the thing. The fridge mechanic doesn't just work for stuff like this. The fridge mechanic works for any team where you have these three elements. It will help you generate more seeds, whether you're playing a Bloom team or a Hyper Bloom or Burgeon team that happens to have a Cryo unit. Now, obviously, the more Electro and the more Pyro you apply, the less often you'll get this interaction to happen. But if you end up using units like Toma that don't apply Pyro too often, or like Raiden or Cookie that don't apply Electro too often, then you can actually take pretty solid advantage of the fridge mechanic in those teams. One of the things that I've been liking a lot I'm not quite sure if my Kaya has enough ER, but I guess we'll see. I guess he does. But you can do stuff like this. Bennett is obviously not the only option you have, but generally when you fridge, you're increasing the amount of seeds you generate, which increases self-damage, which obviously makes having a healer a little bit more valuable. But you can also do it with Toma. But yeah, you can also do it with different Hydros, different Cryos, different Pyros, different Dendros. This mechanic, which is using Fridge and Burgeon, which I have decided that I was going to call Oven because it's like Fridge but hot, I've been liking a lot. It's kind of just like playing the normal Burgeon teams, but you actually maintain freeze uptime with like, or a decent amount of freeze uptime on the enemies, which obviously makes it easier to dodge and to not get hit by enemy bullshit, which is nice. But yeah, we might as well, since we mentioned it, go over using the Fridge mechanic in Hyper Bloom team, which I didn't figure out a fancy name for, so I just decided it was going to be called Hyperfridge. It says what it does, so there's that. But Hyperfridge is very much just the same idea, but with Electro. Obviously, in Hyper Bloom teams, the self-damage is a lot less of an issue because you'll only do self-damage if you're like really close to the enemies. And when it comes to enemies that aren't like easy to group, I've generally been liking the Hyperfridge stuff more than the Oven stuff. But they're both very solid. And that's kind of it. All of those teams have, honestly, like thousands of variations. In basically every single one of those teams, you have multiple options for each one of your slots. And so because of that, the amount of possible like variations on that team that you can do, maybe it's not thousands, I'm too lazy to actually figure it out, but it's a lot. And I really like that because it means that you can kind of just experiment with the units you like. And honestly, I would recommend it. Most of the Dendro teams, even the like weaker Dendro teams, because Dendro's floor is so high, because it's like transformative damage, where things that matter are your unit's level and elemental mastery, and you can only stack so much elemental mastery, then even the like Dendro teams on the weaker side are still generally somewhat strong. And so it gives you so many things you can do. I like Kaya. Kaya is one of the few characters on my account that has crowns, and so playing him in Hyperfridge has been a blast. if you like Chongyun, you've got a unit you can play in Hyperfridge, and where usual Chongyun teams can't really take advantage of his card application in a way that matters, or aren't very good. In Hyperfridge Dendro teams, he's both synergistic and the team is good. And so even if he's not necessarily the best choice for the team, it still feels like he's contributing to the team's success. And that's nice. And there's just so many units that have that. And I'm just really, really happy about that. And I think that's really cool. As a general rule, I'd say that the stronger Burgeon teams, I mean, they're gonna depend on the situation, but the ones that I've had the most success with, like, that I've felt are more impervious to the passage of time and to the passage and to the rotations of Abyss, getting new types of enemies and all that, generally is going to be, I mean, obviously Hyper Bloom as a baseline is just a bit too brain dead to be bad. Salad as well. Anemo Burgeon stuff I've liked a lot. Electro Burgeon or Curry stuff I've liked a lot. Normal Burgeon stuff is a bit more situational, same for Fridge. And then Oven and Hyperfridge are generally not going to be quite as good, but they're not too far behind and they're a lot funnier. So I like that. Does that do it? Am I forgetting anything? Oh, actually, yeah, another thing. You can actually play Ayaka Fridge, or something I'd recommend more, Ayaka Oven or Ayaka Hyperfridge. So you can actually play your Ayaka in a Dendro team if you want to. Because I know that a lot of people have Ayaka because she's a pretty popular unit, but also like Dendro because it's new. And I'm sure a lot of people have their Ayaka mostly benched and not really using it that much nowadays. If that's you and you feel like playing her more, feel free to play Ayaka Hyperfridge because it's good and it's funny. Is it going to be better than Ayaka's usual teams? Generally not, although it can be decent depending on situation. So that kind of does it. Actually, no, there is one last thing that I haven't shown and that I should show. I've told you how you can use Anemo to reduce the burning aura and get vaporizes and blooms from your Hydro instead of just vaporize. Well, you can do that with Crystallize as well. Where you'll trigger a Vaporize and a Bloom on your burning, which I haven't found much success with, but it is good to know. One thing I haven't really tested is with an actual like on-field Joe unit like Noelle. Right, very cool. No, I let him infuse. But you get the idea. If you really want to Borpa spin, my Noelle is level 70, and her shield is not very strong. And she's not built for defense right now, so her shield is even weaker. So just keep that in mind. I can't Borpa spin, man. But yeah, obviously, if your Noelle was built, you wouldn't fucking die. And I'm not even really dying to the self-damage, I'm just getting a hit because I'm spinning and I can't dodge while I'm spinning. Alright, I give up. You get the idea though, right? Like you can kind of do it with literally anything. Even if it shouldn't make sense and it shouldn't work, it still can. And that's one of the many things I like about it. It's really nice to have so many options. And I hope that's what you take away from this video, is that there's just so many fucking things you can do with the Bloom related stuff. And yeah, I hope you have a nice rest of your day. Don't forget to do the things. You know the things. I don't need to tell you, right? Right? And thank you for watching. I'll see you around. Bye, YouTube.